And Imam Abu Yusuf, who will talk about in the future lectures, um, he asked his Sheikh, Imam Abu Hanifa, once that, how did you come to fiqh? And he said that, of course, this comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He said, I wanted to look at knowledge. I looked at everything that's out there. I read everything that I could, everything under the sun. And after that, I came to the conclusion that I will read Kalam. Kalam theology or dialectical theology, because Kalam is about argumentation, speech. You make a point, they respond, you respond, and you have a debate, right? That's what Kalam is. And then you're trying to um, defend or prove the existence of God or certain principles, creedal matters. So Imam Abu Hanifa was really engaged in this science first. And then afterwards, through various experiences, he decided that he would then move to other sciences. And the thing with Kalam, and this isn't, I'm not generalizing it. If you just study Kalam on its own, it's useful in sharpening your intellectual abilities and your ability to debate with people, but you also need to live in the world. And sometimes you can become very, very hardcore because you become very convinced of your worldview, and that's what you're fighting for. And it can sometimes, with some people, lead to sectarianism, this division that we're right and everybody else is wrong. So Imam Abu Hanifa says, then I studied grammar, I studied literature, which was very, very important because to study Islam, to be a scholar, you need to know the language of Islam, which is Arabic. And then he studied logic, which we call mantiq. He read poetry, and he had, questions and so forth. And then he came to the Quran, qira'ah, then hadith. So he went through the whole gamut of Islamic education. And then he said, I came to fiqh. And when I studied it, no matter which way I look at it, it only increases you in esteem. And I couldn't find anything to fault about it. And so I sat with the fuqaha, I sat with the ulama, I looked at their character, and I saw them that because of their learning and their practice of their faith, these people were really the people I should be a part of. And the only way you can seek the next world is through living in this world, and fiqh teaches you how to do that. And so he decided to dedicate himself to fiqh, because you can't worship Allah without knowledge. How do you perform the prayer and all these other things? So Imam Abu Hanifa eventually came to fiqh, but he did go through the sciences, and you'll see that he was very strong in his kalam, in his theology, purely because he dedicated himself to learning. And so he knew the Quran very, very well. And this is something that Hanafis are really, really focused on, that this idea of sticking to the literal words of the Quran as much as possible, because the Quran, for us as Hanafis, is the strongest form of truth. And so if you're debating, if you want to practice faith, then you want to go to the strongest form of truth, and that's the Quran. And so the Hanafis are particularly focused on, when they build their truth, their epistemology, they particularly focus on Quran. Anyway, this is something that Imam Abu Hanifa devoted himself to as well. And of course, you can understand why he was into Kalam and theology, dialectical theology, because Kufa was a city that was busy with people coming in and out from all sorts of backgrounds, all sorts of religions, all sorts of debates taking place under Muslim rule. And this is something interesting because Muslims were never insecure. So you could debate anything by Islam, as long as, of course, you weren't being violent. And Muslims were ready to take it on because they were confident. Because when you're a civilization, when you're an empire and you're on the rise, then you can do whatever you want, literally. But the difference between Muslims and empires today, or world powers today, is that Muslims allowed people to have their difference of views, but they knew what they believed in and did not force it upon others, and they did not engage in violence against others unless they engage in violence against them. So it's something to just keep in your minds as well. Now, I want to mention someone that's important in our journey with Imam Abu Hanifa, and that's someone called Hamad ibn Abi Sulaiman. And this was one of the teachers that Imam Abu Hanifa devoted himself to. He studied with him. He stayed with him pretty much until his death. Um, and so there's a lot of conversations amongst ulama around how long did he stay for, um, and when did Imam Abu Hanifa start teaching, and these sort of questions that do come up as well. So I'm not going to go into all of this because this is really beyond our discussion, but we are going to come back to maybe in this slide, in this lecture, to Hamad ibn Abi Sulaiman, a very important scholar among many that Imam Abu Hanifa benefited from. We know Imam Abu Hanifa when he was around 40 years old. He took the place of his sheikh when he passed away, and he began to teach in Kufa, and people would present to him fatawa cases, and he would then have to, based on his training, respond to them. Okay? But I want to mention two things that are important. Not only where his teaching is important, but I think there were other things that were important about him. And one of them is what I've talked about already, which is that he had a certain financial independence. This is important because lots of young madrasa graduates come to me, students of knowledge come to me, and they always ask, what do we do? It's difficult because when you're not financially independent, number one, you're always tied to institutions and organizations, and you work at their behest. Number two is that when you're working in a field that's completely unrelated to scholarship, like working in a business or a company or whatever, while you're earning income, it's good, but you're not able to focus on scholarship because you're simply concerned with putting food on the table. And that takes you away from what you want to do, which is writing, reading, and teaching. So Imam Abu Hanifa was blessed that his family had a business and they were in the silk trade, which is highly profitable. Now, the ulama say, did he give up trade altogether later on? We don't know, but what we do know that it helped him. So financial independence is an important ingredient in producing scholarship. Some of the greatest books that have been produced were produced by scholars who could wholeheartedly pretty much engage themselves in learning. They didn't have to worry about working in a factory or something else, unlike sadly ulama today. And that's one of the reasons perhaps that we struggle with scholarship, because our ulama, our madrasa graduates, and their primary concern naturally is to put food on the table. Okay, there are many other scholars who've done this as well, but he was wealthy. He wasn't. He wasn't. As a result, he was independent, and therefore he was free from government. He didn't have to worry about the Abbasids or the Umayyads trying to control him. He was free from government. And so this is very, very important. So we should all aspire to become scholars, but become scholars who have a degree of financial independence. And if you don't become a scholar, you should at least work with friends and colleagues who have business, who have money. Muslims have lots of money. You just need to use it in more intelligent ways to support scholars. Find great minds, great scholars, and fund them to produce scholarship. If you're making millions of pounds a year, paying someone 40, 50,000 pounds is nothing to get them to produce scholarship which should benefit the ummah. Imam Abu Hanifa was also very, very trustworthy. This is something that's very clear in his life. He was very, very generous, as we know, and he was a faqihun nafs. So he understood the perils of fame, the perils of wealth, and these sort of things as well. He was very devout and very, very religious. We know from many places that he worshipped Allah profusely. He fasted abundantly, and he prayed plentifully at night to his creator. So he wasn't just a great mind who was blessed with a great support structure around him, but he was also someone that knew that all of this came from his creator. Okay, so he was a merchant, a great faqih, but also he was very, very much a strong business person. And we have many anecdotes which we don't have time to go into, which shows that he was quite circumspect when it came to buying and selling. But he was very scrupulous about how he dealt with people. and this idea of trying to be fair and honest in everything that he did. He was very conscious that his income was not tainted by any wrong action. And you'll find this in his lifetime and time again as well. So really, he profited not only, if I may indulge in some liberties here, he profited not only in his dunya, but he also profited in his akhirah. And this very much ties in with the Quran, because Allah, time and time again, uses the metaphor of business, of trade for successful people. Right. So Islam has always been a very trade-friendly religion, believe it or not. And that's clear when you read the books of fiqh as well. Of course, he lived in difficult times. You had the Umayyad rule and the Abbasid rule. There's much written on this, and this leads to a lot of conversations about Imam Abu Hanifa and his positionality on certain things as well. I don't really want to go into it. We would have to have a separate entire session on the Umayyad and Abbasid rule. But if you're really interested about this period, you need to sit down and read books on this. I can point you in directions of where to read and what to read. But it is important in understanding what we will call the cultural or the political milieu in which Imam Abu Hanifa lived in. So, for example, he lived, we know, around 40 years under Umayyad rule, and around 18 years under Abbasid rule. So he experienced the change of dynasties. People like to romanticize Islamic history, and they like to think that it was a smooth 14 centuries. When they read in detail and they get into the nuts and bolts of it, they see it's very, very complicated. But the beauty is that the ulama, broadly speaking, maintained a degree of independence, which also made sure that Islam, as a religion, and its aqidah and its systems remained largely independent of political influence. And that's what we see today, the fruits of that, ironically, because we don't really have the sovereign Darul Islam like we had in the past. But irrespective of that, Islam is still practiced by billions of people around the world without government structures. It would be useful to have them, but the fact that the ulama conceive of Islam and the practice and the study of Islam independently of government meant that when things like this happen now, where we don't have a caliphate, we don't have these sovereign governments that protect us, broadly speaking, then Islam is still, Sunnism is still able to survive. This is a blessing of our faith, that we can still practice in where I live in modern Britain. I can dress like this and I can practice my faith, and there's enough flexibility in my religion to allow me to do that. And so Imam Abu Hanifa was very aware of the power and the strength and the political trepidations of the Umayyad dynasty. They were very, very powerful. He saw their power, but he also witnessed their decline. He also experienced the Abbasid Caliphate when he was early on moving into Persian lands as well. And it was becoming an important part of life there as well. And eventually, when the Umayyads were defeated, sovereignty or power was taken away from them by the Abbasids. There were lots of ikhtilaf, and Imam Abu Hanifa tried as much as possible to remain independent of that. Because what you have to understand is that people are religious. And when you become a sovereign, when you become a leader or caliphate, a lot of your power that you have is predicated upon religious people endorsing you. So ulama can sometimes unwittingly become instruments of political subterfuge. So the ulama have to be really, really careful. We see it today as well. When they come too close to power, it becomes very, very, very difficult. It muddies the water. So the challenges we see today of ulama, too close to power, too far away from power, aloof, etc., is nothing new. This was something that many, many ulama had to deal with. And Imam Abu Hanifa was at times at the receiving end, but he remained aloof from political involvement. Doesn't mean that he didn't care, but he tried to remain independent as much as he could. Um, for example, we don't really know how much he participated in some of the rebellions that took place as well. And there's a lot of discussion whether he was on the side of the Alawites, because they were the ones who rebelled against the Umayyads, and then they later then rebelled against the Abbasids. So there's a lot of things to be said. I don't really want to go into it because it would take up another 2 hours of that history, but I can share with you resources that you, if you want to read and you really want to get into or your teeth into. I enjoy these things, by the way, but it goes beyond, I guess, what we want to talk about in our lecture or discussion today. So the Abbasids, let's talk about knowledge and ilm. So one of the things about fiqh is having a deep understanding, but also having piety, and that's something that Imam Abu Hanifa, may Allah be pleased with him, had in abundance. Um, Imam Abu Hanifa is as much praised as he is criticized in Islamic history. One of the sources I'll mention right at the end traces that how Imam Abu Hanifa, early on by many scholars, was seen as heterodox, i.e., he was seen on the margins of Sunnism, and then how over time his genius and how people began to understand his complexity made him someone actually that was fundamentally made part of Sunnism. So we have this idea that he was seen by many people as sort of like on the fringes, but later on, over time, he became someone that was very much important to Islam. And there's a lot of myths and ideas that surround Imam Abu Hanifa. But I think the main reason is he was independent. He had an independent mind of thinking. So he wasn't beholden to sectarian interests. Today, many people are sectarian. So their views and their judgments and their understandings are colored by their ethnicity, perhaps, or their particular training, or their teachers. But Imam Abu Hanifa, because of his eclectic background, because he studied with many ulama, he learned from everybody under the sun, even if he disagreed with them, he was able to think for himself. And so people initially weren't able to follow his ideas. And this isn't unique to Imam Abu Hanifa. You'll find some of the great minds, even until this day, initially, they're not accepted by people. You have points in history where their books saw even burnt. Someone that we will talk about in a second, Imam Ghazali, his university almost accepted as a great scholar, but there were points in Islamic history where, for one reason or another, his ideas were banned or his books were burnt. We have records of this. And a lot of time it's to do with ignorance, just pure ignorance. People haven't read about them, they haven't engaged with them, so people kind of have negative views about them. But Imam Abu Hanifa was a faqih. He was a man who was known. So Fuzail ibn Iyaz, Allah be pleased with him, said he was a man who's known for his deep learning, and he taught day and night. So we have teachers like that today, who just teach. That's all they do, and they're right. And he had, his reputation was well known. He was often silent. He was a man of few words but deep insight. And he could work out over time the difference between something that's halal, haram, or permissible, impermissible, or good and evil. And so he really embodied not only deep understanding but piety. So sometimes we have this dichotomy in our learning. What one present day author, Professor Ibrahim Musa, in his book, which is called What is a Madrasa, he has a section where he talks about the Republic of Piety and the Republic of Letters, where sometimes people think that knowledge is being pious, and that's it, just being pious, and that's what knowledge is. And then some people, they just think about learning, studying, but they don't practice. And what you're supposed to do is bring them both together. You're supposed to practice the faith, but have a deep understanding of fiqh, of what it is, of what is it that Allah wants from me. And that's when you become a real faqih. So Imam Abu Hanifa really, was someone like this, and he was blessed with certain innate qualities. Allah blessed him. Allah chose him to take on this responsibility of ilm. He also had great mentors and teachers. His personal life and experiences, as we've touched upon, were formative in developing the great Imam. And in the world that he lived in an environment where it was intellectually diverse, rich, cohesive, open. Societies that are open, societies and cultures that engender learning to all perspectives are really societies that become rich. This is rich intellectually. This is what made Islamic civilization really powerful. They took on all forms of learning. Unfortunately, we don't see that today, and this is one reason the Muslim world, and even as Muslims living in the Western lands as diaspora Muslims, we have a very narrow view of what knowledge is and learning is, and that's only come to our own detriment. And there's lots to be said on that, and I can give you many resources to help you think about that. This here is something that I teach. I teach a lesson or series on Imam Ghazali's Ihya Ulumuddin. Now, Imam Ghazali is a great genius, great mind. He's obviously Ash'ari in his theology, broadly speaking, and he's Shafi'i in his madhab. But in his Ihya Ulumuddin, he has a chapter called Kitab al-Ilm, and he talks about what knowledge is. And then he says that I'm going to tell you about the fuqaha of Islam. And I think this is really important because this is a non-Hanafi mentioning Imam Abu Hanifa and his qualities alongside other ulama. And he's also listing qualities that makes one a great scholar. So he says, I'm going to tell you about the states of the fuqaha of Islam and how great they were and their minds. Okay. And so he says the fuqaha who are from the group of fiqh and who are leaders in or the exemplars in creation and ones who have many followers. He mentions five here. And remember, he's writing in his time, 5th century, 6th century. He talks about Imam Shafi, of course, that's going to be Imam Shafi, Imam Malik, Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, and Sufyan al-Thawri, rahimahullah. May Allah be pleased with all of them, because that was also a madhab, the fifth one was also a madhab. And he mentions certain things about them. He says, وَكُلُّ وَاحِدٍ مِّنْهُمْ كَانَ عَابِدًا. Every one of them was an abid, someone who assiduously worshipped Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, you know, when people say they're Hanafi, one of the things about Hanafiya or being a faqih is being someone who is dedicated to Allah. Zahidan, the English word is asceticism, but it basically means disinterested in the dunya, more about the life to come and their Lord, and not interested in worldly pursuits, vainglory, and all of these worthless pursuits that lots of people fall into. That was the second thing. وَعَالِمًا بِعُلُومِ الْآخِرَةِ. There were scholars who knew about the knowledge of the afterlife. In other words, whenever they thought, whenever they wrote, whenever they spoke, their views were always colored by the afterlife. They never saw this world and that world, the next world as separate. And then وَفَقِيهًا فِي مَصَالِحِ الْخَلْقِ فِي الدُّنْيا. And they cared about people. They cared deeply what benefited people. So they might hold themselves to very high standards in their own personal life, but they wanted what's best for people. Maslaha, what's best for people in this life. They didn't want to burden them with unnecessary commitments. And then the last one, most important one, وَمُرِيدًا بِفِقْهِهِ وَجْهَ اللَّهُ تَعَالَى. And they desired with their deep understanding the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So, you know, this is Imam Ghazali talking about what a scholar is. And this really encapsulates who Imam Abu Hanifa and amongst others are. These are great minds and great scholars of our tradition. And so Imam Abu Hanifa was blessed with innate knowledge. Innate knowledge means Allah blessed him to be able to absorb all this ilm. This is a gift that Allah gives to whoever He wishes. ذَلِكَ فَضْلُ اللَّهِ يُؤْتِيهِ مَن يَشَاءُ. But he practiced his knowledge. So I want to really emphasize this about Imam Abu Hanifa, that he was very calm, very tolerant, and he was very open-minded, and he had a sharp mind. He practiced everything that he had learned. And you'll find many, many anecdotes about him, about Imam Abu Hanifa. I just want to share this. This is from a PhD thesis by a good friend of mine. The reference is here, Dr. Suhail Hanif. And in his thesis, he talks about three things that are unique about the Hanafi madhab. I don't think I mentioned this in this series of lectures. So I'm going to just take a moment to tell you about this because a lot of people don't understand how the Hanafi madhab actually works. And this really stems from an ignorance of it. Um, so he says that the school is different from other schools or stands out in many ways. Number one is there's a particular rationalism. So it's not rationalism, but a particular form of rationalism which is associated with the school. Okay. And people, they attack Imam Abu Hanifa. You see this in books that attack Imam Abu Hanifa to say, they were too much inclined towards rational insights, um, at the risk of contradicting hadith. This is the accusation that's made. Um, and so, if a school from the time of Abu Hanifa is giving a lot of credence to rational inference, then naturally it's going to become very, very sophisticated. So people today who don't study logic, who don't take the time out to understand reasoning, which is actually formed from the Quran, will look at this and say, oh, this is all kuffar, this is all batil and bid'ah. But they don't understand that it's actually taken from the Quran and the Sunnah. Okay. For example, Ibrahim alayhi salatu salam, Abraham, he is really a great thinker. We see this in the Quran amongst many other prophets as well. So you see this. The second thing is the Hanafis have their own usul al-fiqh that's different to other schools of usul al-fiqh. So if you're studying Shafi'i usul al-fiqh or you're studying usul al-hadith, don't be surprised if you find a different answer to the Hanafi madhab, or if you study the Hanafi madhab and you find a different answer, because your method is fundamentally different. Doesn't mean it's right or wrong. What it means is that the method which you've used to try to come to the answer will be very different, and that's perfectly fine. Okay. And the Hanafis have a very different epistemology to the other schools. They don't really have usul al-hadith. Their usul al-hadith is really embedded in their usul al-fiqh. And the third thing, which really builds on the first or the second one rather, is there is a strong attachment to the cases that were transmitted, that have reached us, not just from Abu Hanifa, but from the circle of Imam Abu Hanifa. So during the 2 centuries where the Hanafi madhab came together, 5th and 6th century, the classical period, you'll find that a lot of books until today try to go back to that period. And now, alhamdulillah, with manuscripts making their way public, we're able to read these books and we're able to lean into the early Hanafi. What was the asal position? What was the real position on any question as well? So they will focus a lot on the legal cases that Imam Abu Hanifa and the early generation were really focused on. Okay, so there's a lot to be said, and there's also other things that I might share later on.